heard that it's quite full for a Miller lecture, so thank you very much for coming. My name is Christina Großmann. I'm professor for anthropology of Southeast Asia, and welcome to the Bonn Center for Dependency and Slavery Studies. For those who are not so familiar with this place, it's a center, nurtured, so to say, of the Excellence Cluster, funded by the German Research Foundation, and it's got awarded the second phase, and the second phase is from this year until 2032. So we have a lot of opportunities for more Miller lectures. Yeah. The overall topic of the BCDSS is, as I said, for those who are not so familiar, is working on dependencies, on strong asymmetrical dependencies, in a historical but also in a contemporary context. And we have five. I'm a PI at the cluster, so that's why I'm engaging here in this topic. And there are 5 research areas, and one of them is economies of strong asymmetrical dependencies. And its framework, we invited Caroline and I invited Ben here in order to strengthen this research area and also the contemporary focus of strong asymmetrical dependencies. You don't have to use this term. It takes some time to, yeah, it's just like the common topic of or the common key term of the cluster. Yeah, and now I want to, you introduce Ben shortly, yes. And then the floor is yours.
Yeah, so my name is Karen Hamloch. I'm a junior research group leader in the department of Christina and also in the cluster. And our little group works on labor regimes and global production networks, and very much closely working on texts that have been produced by our speaker today. So yeah, I'm very pleased to welcome Benjamin Selwyn today. And Benjamin Selwyn is a professor for international development and international relations at the University of Sussex in the United Kingdom. His research lies at the intersection of political economy and development studies, focusing on global value chains or global production networks, and the implications for labor relations, value distribution, and uneven development. His work has been published widely in numerous journals and books. And specifically, Ben's work critically situates global production networks or value chains within broader questions concerning the dynamics of contemporary capitalist development, centering on questions of labor exploitation, labor agency, and class dynamics. Today in this lecture, he will draw on his latest book, co-authored with Christine Benholt, who's at the University of Hamburg, which develops the concept of capitalist value chains, as you can see here on the slide, as an analytical intervention into the global value chains framework and discussions. This lecture addresses how these global production systems are linked to labor exploitation, environmental harm, as well as geopolitical conflict, and interrogates the limits of more dominant narratives around upgrading perspectives in development theory and policy. So now I have the pleasure of handing over to Benjamin Selwyn.
Thanks very much. So just to thank Caroline and Christine for the invitation. This is the Centre of Excellence, and I've met you guys and I've met your students. And I can attest just to being here that I can see why that is. Maybe that's my SOAS bias and the fact that you're doing really important work on labour regimes and global production and connecting kind of micro to macro dynamics. But that is what needs to be done in this day and age. In social sciences, it is all too often to slice the pie or the cake so small and so thinly that you lose picture of the whole system. And in fact, many social scientific disciplines rely on a non-systemic approach to understanding the world to justify themselves. So it's really good that you're doing this, because that pushes back against that and enables you to ask really important questions. I often go to academic conferences and I think, are these people spending years and years and years working really, really hard and getting really intelligent to purposely ask the wrong questions? It seems the case to me. Maybe that's my bias, we'll see. So that's the first thing, so thank you very much. I've also had the pleasure, very kindly, of showing me around Bonn. It's a lovely city, a real pleasure to be here. Okay, so this lecture I'm going to be talking about global value chains, which is the mainstream conception of thinking about what is also known as global production networks, or more popularly, global supply chains. Obviously, after COVID, after the illegal war in Iran by the US and Israel and the closure of the Straits of Hormuz, we are all hearing about global supply chains, but we are talking about the same thing. Global supply chains, global value chains. We call them capitalist value chains because we argue that this enables us to see what's really going on rather than to mystify the reality at play. So this is a picture, this is an image of our book, Capitalist Value Chains. And funnily enough, a lot of the time, when people see this image for the first time, they think they're not quite sure what those are. They think they're worms or something like that. But just to reassure, they're not worms, they're rusting chains. Rusting as opposed to pristine. Rust, death, destruction. That's what we're talking about. Chains, power, oppression, exploitation. That's what we're talking about. Why is it so important to have this image on a book about global supply chains or global value chains? The answer is just do a Google search for global supply chains and you'll see most images are really happy, positive, dynamic. Oh, isn't capitalism great? Look at these big ships with all this amazing consumer goods on it. Or look at the earth surrounded by this light and power of our ability to harness our expertise in creating this world around us. That's the mainstream version. The minute there is a crisis like there is at the moment, you have politicians and academics and theorists saying, we need to resolve this crisis. We need to make sure that global supply chains work. We need to make them more resilient. We need to do friend shoring and so on to make sure this system gets back to normal through resilience and so on. And we are arguing something very different indeed. Just if you want to follow this up, here are some of the articles I've published over the last year that go along with this book. The geopolitical underpinnings of global value chains and production networks. We make the point that these approaches, global value chains, global production networks, they emerged in this period of liberal peace, so-called liberal peace theory in the 90s and 2000s. And they didn't even think it was worthwhile thinking about geopolitics in the construction of the conceptual categories that they deployed in order to explain the emergence and existence and operation of global supply chains. Environmental upgrading and the barriers to it. There's a huge industry now talking about how to make value chains more sustainable. And we have shown in this article that individual value chains can become more sustainable. Individual firms can become more sustainable. Yes, it is possible for one or two of them to have it. But if you have this system in a context of expanding growth, the sum undermines the progress of the parts. Twin transitions. Everyone's talking about digitalization in order to make more efficient economic operations and to reduce environmental harm. And again, that is possible. The last mile, so-called, of logistics deliveries can be greatly enhanced by AI. If you know that you can do a right turn here and avoid all of that traffic to get to your warehouse, you can avoid increasing pollution, right? But if that's done in a situation of increased economic growth, and in a situation where increased efficiency enables greater extraction, what you will lead to is not efficiency, not the green transition, but systemic ecocide. And then here I'll talk about eco-social foundations, where we combine and bring together ecology and the labour process, not as two distinct social scientifically differentiated processes, but something that's integrated and it can understand from the perspective of capitalist political economy. Now here is the opposite image to the image of our book. This picture here, that is supposed to be celebratory image of the mastery of the world by human activity, by workers' labour, employed by capital to create this massive energy flows that can light up the world, and we can see it from space. And this is the image of the World Bank Development Report 2020 on global value chains, the age of global value chains. And this is simply a quick explanation for those of you who are not working on the subject. What are these global supply chains? If you look at your computer, if you look at your iPhone, or so much of the technology around us, you will understand that these things are not made in one country. They're not even just made in China. I mean, Apple iPhones and laptops are made in about 50 countries, if you include the sourcing, delivery, logistics, and so on. These are production that's globally fragmented across borders. Rewind 100 years to Detroit, Henry Ford's factory. The car was made in the factory. Material is largely sourced from the same region. Perhaps not the rubber, but generally is made there. Nowadays, it is global production fragmented across borders. And yet, this fragmentation is not organized through markets. These are organized by the lead firms, the Walmarts, the Apples, the Amazons. They implement a series of plans to control this global fragmentation of production, to make it as efficient as possible, to increase the efficiency, because the greater your efficiency, the more competitive you are. They do this on a mass scale, greater than we've ever seen before. In fact, their planning overshadows the planning of the former Soviet Union. So planning under capitalism exists. It always has done, actually. If you read Ronald Coase's very good article called The Nature of the Firm, I think it's published in 1937, he shows how, forget the free market, within the firm, planning. That's what he says. And he's writing from a liberal perspective. Now, he's writing about the planning within the firm. When we talk about global supply chains, we're talking about planning between firms. The global supply chains make up around 70% of international trade. So another way of putting it is, these represent the framework, the skeleton, the scaffolding of the world system. This scaffolding is organized through planning. And so what the real value, to start off with, of the global value chain approach, which I started doing my PhD using, and which emerged in the 1990s. I mean, it had a longer history going back to world systems approach, which I won't talk about, but I can talk about in the Q&A if you'd like. The great value of the GVC approach was that it punctured this myth of planning, of a market economy. In the 1990s, we were being told there is no alternative to the market. The market is the best form of organizing complex economic activities through the price mechanism. This was post the fall of the Union, and this was how we were told the world worked. The GVC approach showed that to be erroneous. 70% of international trade flows through GVCs, punctures the myth of the free market, and it enables, as myself, Karim, and everyone here who's doing this kind of analysis, it provides a framework for doing very close range, micro level, detailed analysis of a single commodity, of a single area of production. And this is not just old style area studies or the focus on a single product. It's about connecting that product, in my case, grape production in Northeast Brazil, to processes that take place on the other side of the world, where planning determines how this product is going to be produced and has a major impact on the developmental outcomes of the production of that product. So, for example, we could be sitting around a board like this in the City of London or for a big retailer, and we could be talking about our schedule for the 52 weeks of the year, what fruit and vegetables we want to be sourcing, and then we could zoom in and we could say, okay, we want grapes. What do we want with these grapes? Well, we want nice grapes that consumers are going to like. We want a certain sugar level. We want a certain greenness to the berries. We want a certain berry size. All of these decisions can be made by us, and they'll be filtered down into the places like Northeast Brazil, and they will have to deal with the consequences of our decisions. If they're able to, they can upgrade into the chain. They can integrate themselves into our sources of supply. If they can't, they're pushed out and they have to do something else. So the GVC approach is very useful for puncturing the free market myth and for showing how planning works, exists, and for linking planning in one part of the world to developmental processes and outcomes in another part of the world. So in that sense, I do owe a debt of gratitude to Gary Gareffi and other key thinkers in the GVC approach, because they provided this to us for doing our PhDs, for doing our research, and it's still, and it will remain for a long time ahead, a very useful approach. But the problem is that Gary Gareffi and others developing this framework, they started in a trajectory which was already a more mainstream, a less critical version than what came before. It emerged in world systems theory. World systems theory, as you know, with Wallerstein, Arrighi, their prime concern was to explain the division of the world between rich and poor, between core and periphery. As the commodity chain approach emerges within the world systems theory, Geography mobilized it into the way that I explained it just now in terms of the research agenda, changing it to the global commodity chain approach. By the 2000s, it became the global value chain approach. It goes from a framework to understand global inequality, fast forward 20 years, to a framework to understand development and upgrading and capital accumulation and business strategies in these chains. So it goes from a critique of to a celebration of capitalist development. And in that process, it loses a lot. But to be honest, even in its original form, the framework was lacking somewhat. Let me speak in more straightforward terms, in terms of an example here, because it's easy for us academics to get all hyper theoretical, but it's really important to ground theories in concrete processes that we can understand. And then we can test these theories. We can show that these theories actually correspond to these processes that we're looking at. So think about your laptop. We are dependent on our laptops, on our mobile phones, on the technologies that have emerged over the last 30 years or so. It's not just that we depend on them, we depend on them to relate to each other. They are absolutely essential. So I'll start off. Cobalt, a key mineral in the world economy, key to laptops, mobile phones, and other technologies. How is it produced in the first place? Well, here you have artisanal mining. It could be in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is one of the largest producers of cobalt. Here you have, and you can see in the foreground and the background, you have a mother and their child mining, breaking open rocks and extracting the product which will become cobalt. There is a large proliferation, as Amnesty International showed in its report around 10 years ago, of child labour. And even if you discount the child labour, these conditions are very tough. So adults are experiencing tough conditions here. This corresponds exactly to the centre's approach to understanding not necessarily slavery, but some of the worst excesses of capitalist development. Forms of labour that we would not be happy with seeing here, that we certainly would not be advocating that the International Labour Organization and other organisations aim to push aside and get rid of. This is phase one, if you like, of the laptop value chain. Phase two, much cobalt is processed and then it's shipped to China, where it's processed again. China has one of the largest processors of rare earth and other critical minerals in the world. It possesses between 70 and 80% of them. It processes around 90% of them. And this processing has enabled China to achieve a very high degree of economic development, which I'll go into a moment. But of course, the costs have been quite immense. What you have is the processing, which requires a huge amount of water, a huge amount of materials, various forms of acid and so on, to process the materials into a finished product that can be then used in computers and smartphones, is processed here. And this is pink produce that flows into the rivers, poisons the drinking water. And there are in China what I call cancer villages, areas of China where the rate of cancer is just significantly higher than what it was before or what the average is. And these are direct consequences of the rare earth processing and critical mineral processing production process that's taking place there. So this is the next phase. So we're talking the workers in these factories that are doing this are exposed to dangerous chemicals, and people who live around or even far away, but the water gets to them through the rivers and through the groundwater, are exposed to this. A huge percentage of groundwater in China is now unfit for human consumption. These are the ecological consequences, political ecological consequences of this rapid development of these new technologies. Then you go to the next phase, where you're talking about the production in places like Shenzhen, under Foxconn, Pegatron and other huge corporations, multinational corporations that supply Apple, and they have a very strict and very particular labour regime. So, for example, you have the biggest migration in world history, 250 million people have left the rural areas for the urban areas in China under the Hukou system, which is a family registration system, which discriminates between urban and rural dwellers, with the rural dwellers not having the same rights when they're living in the urban areas as the urban dwellers. And so they provide this ready-made force for a very cheap labour regime. And they're subject to high levels of discipline. They work very long hours. Their weekly wages are too low to support themselves, to reproduce them and their families' social reproductive needs. And so what is common in places like Foxconn and Pegatron is a very long working week, 60, 70, 80, 90 hours working week is the norm. You've heard of 996, working from 9 in the morning to 9 in the evening, 6 days a week. This is expanding across places like China, and it's sort of reaching other parts of the world as well. This is the labour dynamics there. And then the final image here, and this is a simplified image of the value chain here, is the destruction and waste and the reprocessing that takes place here. This is in Ghana, the capital city. You have a very famous rubbish tip where you have adults and children taking out the metals from the computers, from the smartphones, and recycling them. This is celebrated as part of the circular economy, which is extremely popular nowadays as a concept to relieve ourselves from having to destroy the planet. We can recycle instead. And this is an example of the circular economy at work. And here again, you have extreme conditions, acid leaching, burning, with not just child labour, but also exposure to real health damage. And a colleague of mine has done very good work on this, showing how there is systemic damage to health and to the environment in this one part of the chain. So you connect these things up in the value chain for your computer, for my computer, and we see that the value chain is based upon high degrees of exploitation, varied forms of exploitation that are globally fragmented but functionally integrated, with a big beneficiary being Apple and the other big computer and iPhone and knowledge owners. So this gives us an image. Now, let's get a little bit more theoretical again. So within the global supply chain approach, the main argument is that the way to achieve development is to achieve upgrading. Upgrading simply means to integrate into the market through integrating to the biggest supplier, the biggest transnational corporation. If you can sell to a transnational corporation, if you can export, you are in the upgrading process. And there are people like Geographic and Fernandez Stark, and of course the World Bank, whose report, the cover you saw a few seconds ago, argue that upgrading is a new paradigm of development. They say, forget about the old idea of national development, of national industrial policies like, say, South Korea, where you had a national economy being mobilized. What you need now is you have integration into value chains through upgrading, through connecting to the transnational corporations. So this is a new paradigm of development. Now, if Garefi and Fernandez Stark had said, this is a new paradigm of uneven development, I'd have said, yeah, I kind of agree with you. But I fundamentally disagree with this argument that is a new paradigm of development. In fact, I think there is a real problem with this, which I'll go into in a second. So the World Bank says all countries stand to benefit from the increased trade and commerce spurred by the growth of GVCs. All countries, their words. Now, what is upgrading? We've got product, process, functional, chain upgrading. Product upgrading, in my case, looking at grapes, you can move from seeded grapes to seedless grapes for the consumer market. Process upgrading is producing something more effectively, more efficiently, using less workers to produce the same output, using the same workers to produce more output. Functional upgrading, if you're talking about grapes, for example, you produce the grapes. Functional upgrading, you can brand the grapes as well. You give it a brand name. That's an example of functional upgrading. Chain upgrading is going to a different market altogether. And of course, you have larger markets. If you can go from national to global markets, that is an example of upgrading. Now, important to be clear, I'm critiquing the idea of upgrading, but there are numerous, thousands, millions of examples of successful upgrading. I think all of us who are doing this kind of work are looking at often cases of upgrading which have worked. Okay, certainly the three of us writing this book have looked at successful cases of upgrading, but all of these successful cases of upgrading do not add up to a big picture statement that all countries can stand to benefit from upgrading in the global value chains. There are many examples that lead us to say that this is not only not generalizable, but it generates other dynamics which undermine this argument altogether. First of all, and I'll go into this in some more detail later, it relies on labor exploitation. If you look at the Chinese massive economic growth in China, yes, very impressive economic growth, but the exploitation of labor has been intense, and many other examples attest to that, which I'll go into as well. Upgrading leads to global polarization. So on one hand, you have the labor regimes of what we call immiserating growth regimes in places like Shenzhen, where workers cannot earn a living wage within 48 hours of a week, and so they have to work longer and longer. So if we argue if you can't earn a living wage within 48 hours of working week, then that constitutes an immiserating growth regime. At the other end of the chain, you have the billionaires in Silicon Valley, and these are functionally connected. It's not that these guys are geniuses and those guys over there are stupid and they deserve their low wages. It's that these guys are relying on the exploitation and transfer of value from there to there. Thirdly, it rests upon nature destruction. I'll go into this in a moment more, but if you look at the proliferation of global value chains since 1991, that is the date when the Soviet Union finished and we had globalization, you look at the global material footprint associated with this period, you have a massive increase, a massive destruction of the environment. And finally, it develops uneven development. So China's rise, very impressive. What has been the other side of the coin of China's rise? Deindustrialization in places like Brazil and Argentina. Now, I'm not a fan of industrialization. I'm not going to stand here and say, we need to industrialize. We need to do what South Korea did, right? But if you look at Brazil, especially between the 1930s and the 1970s, it achieved a high rate of industrialization, which for some development economists is a mark of success. Not for me, but for them it is. And so they would be very disappointed when you see that the process of global integration and the acceleration of Chinese development and the move of Chinese firms to the forefront of competitiveness in the global manufacturing system has basically pushed aside manufacturing in Brazil. What you've had is a collapse of manufacturing in Brazil and a re-primarization. So you have Brazil relying increasingly on soy exports, on beef exports, on iron ore exports. Deindustrialization is the other side of the coin of industrialization. Similarly, you had upgrading in Vietnamese coffee production in the 1990s, and this had a devastating effect on coffee producers in parts of Central America and Sub-Saharan Africa. For the simple reasons that capitalist competition doesn't raise all boats. It raises some at the expense of others. And the final point about geopolitically charged nature of upgrading, I'll come back to in a second. So why does mainstream GVC analysis get it so wrong? It's not because they are not intelligent. These people are very intelligent. They've done a huge amount of work. They're very dedicated. These are dedicated people. They want development. They are committed to development. So why did they get it wrong? Well, this notion of upgrading that I spoke about, the various forms of innovation, product, process, etc. This is a watered-down version of Schumpeter's idea of innovation. Schumpeter talked about how capitalist firms, under the pressure of competition, they innovate through seeking out new markets, new products, new ways of doing things. And so the GVC people have taken Schumpeter's idea and applied it to the global value chain approach. They've done that purposely. You can read it in the guidebook to value chain research by Kaplinski and Morris. They cite Schumpeter again and again. But Schumpeter also said something. He talked about creative destruction. He talked about how capitalism is a very dynamic system, which I think we can all agree on. It generates huge amounts of wealth. it generates massive levels of innovation. Yes, it does. He also said that those innovations destroy firms that are unable to keep up. The destruction is the other side of the coin of creation. You can't have one without the other. This is intrinsic to capitalism. He also said that this process drives monopolization. We have fewer and fewer firms become more and more powerful in the system itself. Now, whilst the mainstream GVC theorists recognize the power of the lead firms, they don't connect any of these things together. They don't see creation and destruction being two sides of the same coin of capitalist development. So this is the real problem. If they had that destructive element in there, they could see how upgrading leads to uneven development. But because they've taken it out to make it more palatable politically for people like the World Bank to use, they lose sight of the path of social reality. Secondly, firm centrism. What does that mean? Like I mentioned previously, the GVC approach is extremely useful. If you want to trace decision-making from one part of the world to another, you can trace them firm by firm as they go down the chain, right? But if you believe that constitutes capitalism, those links between firms constitutes capitalism, what you're doing the classic mistake, which social sciences have done, which is to extract a small part of the pie from reality and then forget about the rest of the pie or the rest of the cake. And so what the firm centrism does is it conflates the existence of the system with the relationships between firms, and it forgets about, for example, the capital-labor relation and the way global value chains emerge out of capitalism and contribute to reproducing it on a greater scale. They contribute to the expanded reproduction of capitalism in an increasingly monopolized form, because those relations between firms are relations of power. Secondly, or thirdly, they have no class analysis. This is something that's notable about the GVC approach and the GCC approach before it, that the class relations were really pushed to the side. So having capitalism without class analysis, well, what does that give you? It gives you a fantastical or fantasy level of understanding of the market. And it's incredible how many times you read mainstream GVC literature, they talk about capitalism, they never define capitalism, they never show how capitalism relates to value chains or how value chains relates to capitalism. They assume that you know what capitalism is, and they leave it at that. I mean, for me, that is not satisfactory at all. That is ideology. And most ironically, they have no theory of value. Global value chains without a theory of value. I mean, most people, if you wrote that as an undergraduate, your teacher would put a red line under it and a big question mark, but they can get away with it because they're powerful. So what do we do? Why are we talking about capitalist value chains? And why are we talking about our critique? The reaction to all of these problems has been long-term, more than 20 years now. People have been writing from a critical perspective about value chains and saying many of the things that I've just said here. A lot of that, which I said, is not particularly original. What people have been doing is doing class analysis in global value chains. So my research, I looked at the value chain for grape production, and I went down to the producer end in northeast Brazil, and I did a class analysis of the production of grapes for export in grape value chains. And so many people have done other things similar to that, or different segments of the chain. So that, again, is not original. People have done that before. What we do in this book is to provide a class analysis of the value chain itself. So we understand global value chains, and we call them capitalist value chains, as systems of generalized appropriation. These are not neutral structures. These are not substitutes for the market in an efficiency terms. These are systems where the most powerful firms are able to structure production in ways that they can maximize surplus value extraction from labor across the world in functionally dispersed but integrated forms of production, where subordinate firms play a part in this because they too benefit by extracting surplus value and keeping some of the surplus value for themselves whilst they transfer the lion's share to the large firms. So we see these value chains as systems of generalized appropriation, of surplus value of workers, of labour, but also of nature, which I'll come to in a moment. And we use the notion of international class relations to explain this. Now, a lot of the time, class relations are thought of in methodological nationalist terms. Class relations in Germany, class relations in Britain. If we look, for example, at the transition debates between a whole range of theorists about the transition from feudalism to capitalism, and this is a very important debate and very useful debate, we'll see the main argument being that the class relations in Britain or in England were different to the class relations in Central and Europe. True. But class relations don't just exist within the national sphere, they are connected. They exist across borders, and especially so with capitalist value chains. And we can see that with these. To put it more concrete, the formation of the Chinese working class, the Hoku system, the migration from rural to urban, much of that was determined by the Chinese state. But much of it was also determined by foreign investment into China, where foreign capital becomes part of the class structure within China. These are the international class relations, where surplus value is created and transferred across borders. And this is particularly important for understanding the heightened form of labour exploitation, because it's not as if workers are only being exploited by one firm. In a way, they're being exploited by at least two firms. Double form of exploitation, new forms of oppression, new forms of labour regimes, and so on. And one thing we point out in the book is that traditionally Marxists have talked about different forms of exploitation. Relative surplus value, where technological upgrading enables workers to produce more value in the same 8-hour period, for example. Absolute surplus value, it works where workers get paid the same amount, but they work longer hours. And through global value chains, you have a combination of these. So you have both in Foxconn, high technology and very long hours. So a combination of different forms of exploitation. I've mentioned about class polarization already. I mentioned the Chinese workers. Yes, wages have gone up. Yes, there's been a huge middle class emerging in China. Yes, this is absolutely true. But at the same time, the working hours have also increased in China. And this is part and parcel of the success, if you want to call it that, of China and of the world economy over the last 40 years. To put it a different way, the world economy has been sustained to a very large extent by the massive increase of working hours of highly exploited Chinese workers. What about geopolitics? What is the connection? We have to understand states not just as neutral actors, but as part of the imperialist system, where you have the US state standing at the top of the imperial chain. Since the Second World War, the US consciously has made global capitalism. Global capitalism is not just an outcome of market forces. It is the role of the United States attempting to mobilize the capitalist classes in, first of all, Western countries and then across the world following 1991 to be part of a system, to benefit from that system, albeit in a hierarchical way as subordinates to the United States and benefiting from it. And they've done a great job, and Trump seems to be wanting to undo it. So this is a key point. The US has made global capitalism. It's made an American rules form of global capitalism where relatively free markets means that US capital can go around the world, where the US state underpins its research and development. One of the points we make out in the book and in this article here is that the ideology of the United States is that we are a free market country. We promote free markets. The reality is, of course, through its military industrial complex and through huge investments into research and development, the US was behind the formation of computer chips and a whole range of technology, including the internet, which are fundamental for the formation and operation and expansion of global value chains. So the US is a key player here. And the reason the US is so feeling problematized by, if that's the right word, by the rise of China is because China now with its own industrial policy, has been able to begin competing. Huawei and other companies are now competitive on the world scale. And so that when you get to these cutting edge technologies, these dual use technologies, which are both civilian use and military use, the US is feeling under pressure. It realizes that if China achieves primacy in these dual use technologies, not only will the US lose its economic primacy, it will also lose its military primacy. And for that reason, even under the Joe Biden administration, and people say Biden is so much better than Trump, well, when it comes to China, he wasn't, because the Biden administration was mobilizing US resources to try and contain the rise of China. And some people, and we quote this researcher saying, the objectives of the Biden administration was to contain and kill Chinese technological development. So geopolitics has not just returned, as much of the literature says. The geopolitics has been there from the beginning, not just in opening up countries through IMF, World Bank structural adjustment programs, but through the investments in the key technologies, the core technologies that underpin and mobilize global value chains. Reshoring, end of GVCs is not happening for the simple reason that, as we see with our smartphones and our laptops, if you look at the periodic table, an old telephone would have maybe 10, 20, 30 parts of the periodic table in it. Contemporary iPhones and smartphones have got 70 or 80% of the periodic table in the smartphone. This means that globalization, global production, that is the sourcing, production, distribution, is inbuilt into all of the technologies that we rely upon. So globalization is not going anywhere at the moment, it's expanding. By the time we finished the book, we provided this figure showing it was expanding. What about nature destruction and how we consider this? And this is the last kind of substantive section before the conclusion. One of the great myths of the last 20, 30 years is that of the cloud, of dematerialization, of living in a post-material society. So the idea of the cloud conjures up this image that we have left behind dirty industry of the past and that we're living in this clean industrial structure. The exact opposite is the case. The material footprint has massively increased. We know it now with the data centers, and we know it with the iPhones and smartphones and laptops, that these require a huge amount of material resources. Just sending an email requires material resources. So it's no surprise that here you have these fuels increasing. The rising material footprint increasing faster than global GDP and the global population. So this idea of the cloud, dematerialized economy, circular economy, yeah, sounds good, but it's not true. It's the opposite, actually. We have got deepening industrial structures taking place. Now, when we come to global or capitalist value chains and nature destruction, it's often the case, and we were talking about this previously over lunch and in other contexts, about how often it's the natural sciences that talk about natural process of destruction, and the social sciences look elsewhere, and that for a long time social sciences have really ignored the natural substructure of our very existence, to the extent that we are taught to think of ourselves as humans rather than human animals. So we are very much part of nature. But when we think about nature and human interaction with nature, we can understand it through class relations, through technological relations. Of course, technological innovations under capitalism are wondrous in a way. If you look at steam trains, steam engines, cars, smartphones, AI, it is incredible what we have achieved. That is the creative side. But the destructive side is that with each of these innovations, each of them requires a greater material footprint. If you think about early mining, for example, you'd have the miner with their pick. You'd have a basic infrastructure of some railway lines and trucks to carry the coal and so on, and a lift to down the mine shaft and so on. If you think about a data worker now, for example, typing away here, you've got the cloud that extends beyond the actual world's Earth surface into orbit. And you've got a huge infrastructure that supports that. And so this is the reason that the material footprint is increasing. Now, under capitalism, you have the exploitation of labour is veiled behind the idea of a fair day's work for a fair day's pay, or vice versa, where we sign a contract, we go to work, and the capitalist honours the contract with pay. So there's a parity, there's an equality, there's a legal equality between capital and labour under capitalism. There's no such thing with nature. Nature is based upon the free appropriation, the transformation of nature into a private property and transformation of it into a free gift. Usually the idea of gift is one where you receive and you give. A free gift is you just take. And this is what the relationship of nature is under capitalism. And we go into detail about the feed meat value chain, and we show the immense destruction that goes with that, with a huge amount of the world's land dedicated to meat production. And if it's not meat production, it's feed, not for food for us, but for the animals, prioritizing the slaughtering of animals for profit over the feeding of humans. So you can have enough food in the world to feed the population, but because they don't have the money to purchase it, they're unimportant, whereas the livestock are important because they're a source of profitability. 25 kilos of grain goes to produce 1 kilo of beef in concentrated animal production. And so we talk about this, the interactive, the interrelated, the conjoint element of nature destruction and class expropriation, in the sense that for capital to control nature, it must be able to control labour. For capital to control labour, it must be able to control nature. It has achieved this through the privatisation of the commons, the transformation of the commons into private property, and the proletarianisation of the global labouring class, and the subjection of that labouring class to the dynamics of capital accumulation. And this is why you have these processes of endless exploitation, endless environmental destruction, and they're conjoined. And in this article, we show how there are numerous attempts to talk about how we can upgrade global value chains environmentally, make them more efficient. And it's true, you can do things. I mean, if you have a livestock, a cow or a bull eating one type of feed, and you substitute that feed for, say, seaweed, it will produce less methane. So you can have an upgraded livestock in the sense that it produces less methane, lower GHG emissions. This is a positive environmental outcome. But this literature is ridiculous in the sense that it says we can do this in order to have more growth. So they're actually talking about more livestock, more feed crops, more nature destruction. So this is a final slide. What is to be done? This book took us a long time to write, and is very difficult. And I thought, well, I'm the professor, so, you know, Dara and Christine, my co-authors, they're going to just agree with everything I say. It was a complete opposite. Maybe I was too nice, but every single chapter I wrote, they said, no, no, no. And I had to write, I'm not joking, about 20 drafts of each chapter. I repaid them. I was as hard on them as they were on me. And one of the things we were arguing about at the end was we should have another chapter on what is to be done. And we decided not to, because it's actually very difficult. Our purpose of this book was to demystify global value chains, and that is enough for one book. But we also thought that for presentations, we should point to alternatives, and I've started writing about this, and we have written about this collectively as well. So in terms of what we finish by saying, this is the first point: capitalism is the problem. A lot of the times we have presentations, you have policy experts and so on who don't talk about capitalism and assume that capitalism is somehow the solution, it must be improved. What if you start off by saying capitalism is the problem? You may be wrong. I often hope I'm wrong. I think, God, if I was wrong, I wouldn't have to be so depressed all the time. I could be really happy. We are moving in the best possible direction. But that's not true, I don't think. You can convince me otherwise. Capitalism is a problem. That means there's no easy policy. Look at your political leaders, look at our political leaders. They have been unable to deal with the problems we face because they believe in the long-term existence of the structures of accumulation and power that they preside over, and they don't believe in really transforming it. And so what you have is, when you think about policy in that terms, you're opening the door to the AFD and to reform and to the worst possible political responses. If you say capitalism is a problem, then you have to say, okay, if it's a problem, what kind of policies can we think about? Then we say upgrading is not the answer. It doesn't matter if you're talking about economic, social, or environmental upgrading. The solution is worse, or the cure is worse than the disease. I haven't even talked in this lecture about workers' agency, which we will be talking about tomorrow at the seminars at length. But just as we were finishing writing this book, just before the elections, when Trump won against Biden, there was this wave of strikes. It's quite short in the United States by dock workers, and they won huge demands, up to 60% pay rises. Why? Because they occupied supply chains where, to quote the former head of Tesla, it takes thousands of pieces or components to build a car. It takes one piece to not build the car. If you can disrupt that one piece, if you can take it out of circulation, you can disrupt the whole chain. And so this is part of the solution, There are also other places we can mobilize around. We had a very nice vegetarian lunch today, and I do think that if we move away from meat-based systems, I'm not saying compulsory veganism. Some people on the left do say that, and I think that's anti-democratic, and it's quite insulting to the billion or so people who depend on livestock rearing, especially in the global south. I'm not talking about eliminating those people's livelihoods at all. I'm talking about the large-scale livestock production in places like Germany, the United Kingdom. 80% of agricultural land in the UK is used for livestock or feed. What a waste of space. What a terrible impact on the environment. But let's transform that into plant-based production for humans, based on agroecology, based upon trying to mend the metabolic rift. And when it comes to AI and these high technologies, I would say that instead of the endless search for efficiency and increasing competitiveness, which there is no limit to under capitalism, we should talk about sufficiency. We can use these technologies, and we can use these technologies to say, once we look like we are running into overdrive in terms of natural resource use, the technology can shut down or reduce the running of the system. We can use the technologies for our own good. These are open-ended issues, obviously, to be discussed. And finally, if capitalism is the problem, then we need economic democracy. And if we do have economic democracy, then we don't have capitalism. So I'll finish there and say thank you very much.